Hello, I'm the Game Professor, and welcome to Games as Lit 101, where we've hit 50,000 subscribers! There was a while where I seemed stuck in the low 40s, and especially considering my difficulty uploading content recently, some part of me feared I might just be stuck there, but here we are, hitting another big milestone. When I hit 10K, I did a poll for patrons to let them vote on a more personal topic for my next video, and I ended up making a video about 5 games that changed my life in some way. I did the same thing this time, and they actually voted on something rather similar, if a bit more specific. The games that shaped my journey towards a greater love for and understanding of video games as a storytelling medium. There are a lot of games out there, and everyone encounters different things at different times, so I want to make clear, this is not a list of games you should play to better appreciate video game storytelling, nor is it a recommendation for how to introduce someone to the medium. Some of these games aren't even all that good. This is just a personal account of the moments that a game made me think about the narrative potential of the medium in ways I hadn't before, and affected the ways I thought about games going forward. Everyone goes on a different journey in this regard, and I'm going to talk about mine. So let's start with the first game I played that I would describe as actually having a story at all. Putt-Putt Joins the Parade. Really though, I should give this credit to the entire Humongous Entertainment catalog of children's adventure games, but this was actually the first one I played. It follows a little car named Putt-Putt as he prepares himself to drive in the Car Town Parade, and the player has to earn money, get a car wash, and save a little dog named Pep that would become a mainstay in the series after this point. This isn't the first game I ever played. If memory serves, that was either Super Mario Bros. And or Duck Hunt, or possibly this weird little Apple game called McGee's Playhouse or something. Okay, I looked it up to confirm it was just called McGee and it's actually kind of horrifying. But my family's Macintosh Performa was the only thing I had to play video games on in my own house for a good portion of my early childhood, so this was the first game that I can remember playing that had story as a pretty major component of it. Said story is nothing all that complex, of course. There are a few ways to accomplish the game's goals, and once you eventually do, you get a cute little video of Putt-Putt driving in the parade with all the other cars. But since it's a point-and-click adventure game, everything you do is a step in progressing that story. I talked to other cars to find out what I needed to do, I mowed lawns to get enough money for a car wash, and I found a bone so that Pep would trust me when I found him in a dark, cold cave. I wasn't really thinking this deeply about it at the time, of course, but the game had a story, and I was progressing it with every action I took. When a Mac is all you can play games on in the early 90s, your options are pretty limited, so compared to games like the Oregon Trail, or shareware games like Spin Doctor and Glider Pro, or the wealth of edutainment games available back then from Number Munchers to Super Solvers to Math Blaster, this feels pretty narratively heavy in hindsight. I could theoretically talk about the Oregon Trail here, but I didn't think of it as an emergent narrative until much later after I was already familiar with the concept, so it doesn't really qualify here. As I hinted at before, this is far from the only game of this type I played as a kid. Putt-Putt Saves the Zoo was my favorite of his series, and if anything, I think Freddy Fish 2 might have been the one that actually got me looking at it as a story, on account of having an actual moral and character arc and such, and the Spy Fox games broadened my horizons a bit by having 2 separate paths of progressing the main story, meaning the whole of Act 2 would change between playthroughs. Kind of impressive in hindsight, even if I didn't really get any of the James Bond jokes as a kid.
Spy Fox, are you okay?
Shaken but not stirred, Mumpy Penny.
Strangely enough, it would be quite a while before the next game that got me thinking more deeply in this regard, because I didn't have any game consoles until much later. I eventually got an iMac for school, but even then there were very few games available on Mac at the time, and I didn't have any consoles of my own until I bought a PS1 with my own money, from a relative who didn't need it anymore because he had bought a PS2. So I was pretty late to this party. And once I had that PS1, I wasn't exactly focusing on story-heavy games. I'd already been obsessing over Crash Bandicoot 2 on my friend's PS1, so I stuck mostly to what I knew. Well, that and Star Wars games. Which is where we get to the next game, believe it or not, and pretty definitely the worst one on the list. Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. Yeah, I know, just hear me out, I promise it'll make sense. This game isn't actually as bad as you might expect. Combat is awkward, and the story takes a backseat to stuffing it full of gameplay, but that much is expected of a licensed movie tie-in on the PS1. But the level design is pretty good, the aesthetic is true to the source material, and it actually does a lot less than many similar games to mess with the story's pacing, one entirely fabricated level on Coruscant notwithstanding. But this isn't a review of the Phantom Menace for PS1. The important thing for our purposes here is that this was the first game I played that was a 3D action-oriented game, but that wasn't all action. I used platforming to explore open areas, haggled and conversed with NPCs to get items and move the story forward, all sorts of stuff like that, which had obviously been done before this game and done better, even by the humongous entertainment games I talked about a minute ago. But this was the first time I encountered it in this context, in a game that also had more typical action design. Like, there's a whole level on Tatooine where I had to find parts to fix Anakin's pod racer by completing side missions, searching for items, trading with NPCs, and I hadn't really encountered anything like that in this type of game. And I remember realizing that I wasn't doing anything cool or fighting anything, but I was still enjoying myself. Plenty of games over the years have given me new realizations about these concepts of format, content, and pacing, but this was the first. So, next on our journey, a trio of games that, taken one right after the other, all helped me realize just how good a video game story could be. Starting with Halo. Considering my love of Star Wars, it should come as no surprise that I loved sci-fi as a kid. So when my cousin got the popular new Xbox game and suggested we play through it with the split-screen co-op, I was naturally very skeptical. Look, I was a kid, okay? I had my allegiance to my PS1 and my GameCube, and the fact that my cousin had defected to Microsoft's Usurper console just to play a first-person shooter, which I also hated because I was raised in quite a conservative environment and thought that first-person shooters were all just brainless, violent wastes of time. So, I wasn't all that interested. But once we started, I was immediately engrossed. It's not the deepest or most complex of stories, but I maintain that Halo was still a compelling sci-fi mystery, and it had its hooks in me hard. The atmosphere, music, and slow process of coming to understand what Halo was and why it was there all glued me to the game like nothing else I'd played before. And by the time the late game twist came about, my mind was sufficiently blown, and there was no going back. I fell in love with a video game for the story. Not too long after that, another big event happened that changed my life. The 2004 Super Bowl. With the wardrobe malfunction during Janet Jackson's halftime show. That's not what changed my life, though. My family went to a Super Bowl party at a friend's house, and I ignored the football game entirely to play video games with their son in another room. And that's how I first played Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time. The story wasn't the thing that struck me at first, that was the presentation. The cinematic camera angles during battle, the parkour animations while platforming, the visually exciting choreography of the moves you could do fighting enemies. It was unlike anything I'd ever played in a lot of interesting and exciting ways. But the real impact happened when I went right on over to GameStop and bought a copy of the game for myself so I could play it through in its entirety. For context, I feel like I should say that I loved reading as a kid. I was one of those kids who was always way above my grade level in reading because I loved reading so much. I just read all the time. I got in trouble once for bringing a Hardy Boys book into church because we didn't have Sunday school that morning and I didn't want to listen to the boring adult service, so just to give you a concept of how obsessed I was, I loved reading. But even beyond my love of books, I also grew up on the stage. My mom regularly directed stage productions from my small hometown of Paradise, California. Point is, I grew up very conscious of storytelling concepts as a kid, to the point where I knew about concepts like this, like protagonists, antagonists, story structure, all these things, well before most kids would learn about them in school. It was just a part of my life. And I was taught that the narrative climax of a story isn't just the point of highest action, as it's often, I think, rather lazily defined in textbooks and such, but rather the point of no return for the protagonist, when their choice has been made and their arc reaches a thematic conclusion. I won't spoil it here. Play the game for yourself or check out my analysis of the game if you want to know more, but I distinctly remember reaching that point in Sands of Time. The dramatic cutscene where the prince decides what's important to him and makes the choice he'd previously hesitated to, and I realized that's the climax. This wasn't just a cool story, it was a cool story with a point to it. A cool story that used the same basic narrative framework that I've been taught to map onto most stories. Books, movies, and now video games all using this same basic narrative framework I'd been taught. I was actually so excited after seeing this that I showed it to my mom a little bit later, and unsurprisingly, showing her the final scene of a video game she knew nothing about when she had never even thought about the idea of games as a storytelling engine didn't really convince her, but she came around eventually. But that was the first time I realized that games couldn't just have cool stories, but they could also have meaningful ones. Stories with morals, themes, messages. Essentially that everything I loved about books could also be found in video games as well. That was kind of a big moment for me. It wasn't until I took a college course a few years later called Film as Literature that I would fully connect the concepts at play here. And yes, the name of this channel is pretty directly based on the name for that class. But even though I had already come to appreciate video game stories before I played The Sands of Time, this was my first step to doing so in a more academic fashion. And to honor that experience, I now make a tradition of ignoring every sports event I can in favor of playing video games. I highly recommend it. That's only 2 of the 3 promised games that represented significant steps forward in my appreciation of video games as a storytelling art form, but I'm gonna need to take a quick aside before the 3rd, because there's an important change that happened between these 2 games that I'm gonna need to talk about. So, let's talk about 2 games that a friend let me borrow at the same time while I was in high school. Castlevania Aria of Sorrow and Metroid Fusion. I talked about these briefly in my Games That Changed My Life video, and the next game too, in case you had any doubts where this was headed. But when I played these, I was fairly early on in my teens, and I still thought that more technologically advanced games were inherently better. That wasn't universal, of course. I mean, I played Wrath of Cortex. I knew newer games didn't always mean better, but as a general rule, I didn't think a Game Boy Advance game could hold a candle to a GameCube game. Which is why I so vividly remember the moment that I was laying in bed, playing one of these games. I don't remember which one exactly, but I realized I could be playing my GameCube right now. So why wasn't I? And of course the answer is simple. Aria of Sorrow and Metroid Fusion are great games, and GameCube or no, I didn't want to play anything else right then, because it turns out technological prowess has very little to do with whether a game is great or not. Which was an important lesson for me to learn before the next game on the list, and the final game of the main Teaching the Game Professor to Love Video Game Stories trilogy, Final Fantasy VII. Yeah, I'm one of those basic people whose first RPG was FF7, but what an RPG it was. I played it nearly a decade after its release, and still, perhaps partially because of my experiences with GBA games a minute ago, it blew my mind. I'd played games with a focus on story before, of course, but even so, the format usually felt like that story was a means to an end. Even the most narrative-heavy cutscene in Halo, and to a lesser extent Sands of Time too, would lead me into the next gameplay segment. While the stories were worthwhile on their own terms, it could at least be argued that they existed more to move the player between gameplay scenarios than entirely for their own sake. I know I've talked about vivid memories of specific moments a lot in this video, but that's because a lot of these games affected me in specific enough ways that I have a pretty strong memory of these realizations, and Final Fantasy VII is no exception to that rule. Early in the game, there's a flashback to the protagonist, Cloud, and his friend Tifa sitting on a water tower and talking to each other under the stars in their childhood home of Nibelheim. And I remember realizing this is only here to develop these characters. There's no gameplay purpose to this scene. It doesn't advance the scenario that leads to the next segment of gameplay. It exists solely for the story. It's a beautiful scene, slowing things down for a nostalgic, bittersweet conversation between 2 friends who aren't going to see each other for a while. And that fascinated me. That the game would take this time to focus solely on its story, to prioritize it that much. If the previous games taught me that video games could have stories, could have compelling stories, could have meaningful stories, Final Fantasy VII taught me that video games could exist specifically to tell those stories. It broadened my idea of what video game storytelling could be, and as the game progressed, it showed me a story that was significantly more emotional, complex, dramatic, and meaningful than just about any I'd experienced before that. And honestly, as far as video games that had a precise and significant effect on my understanding of and love for video games as a narrative medium, that's mostly where it ends. Pretty much everything from there just expands on what those original games sparked in me. But I do want to give a shout out to a few of them, because there were some things that I learned from other games going forward nonetheless. Shadow of the Colossus was, aside from being a beautiful masterpiece in general, the game that introduced me to some of my favorite interactive storytelling tropes, including the protagonist who's not actually heroic, and the ability to fruitlessly fight against the inevitable in an emotionally charged finale. I won't go into any more detail than that, because if you haven't already, you really should just play this game for yourself, but it was a gorgeous and emotionally conflicting experience that set the stage for a number of my favorite game stories to come. BioShock has undergone a lot of critical reevaluation over the years, much of it deserved. Even my own opinions aren't quite the same as when I first made my analysis video on it, but the game does deserve some credit here, both for being the first explicitly political game I played. Final Fantasy VII doesn't count because I was a dumb kid at the time and didn't really notice it, and for continuing my love of games that make the player do things they don't want to at pivotal narrative moments. Of course, even then, it would still be a while before I fully grasped the political significance of the game, since I was a teenager knee-deep in evangelical Christianity and no gods, no kings, only man. It's different when you're steeped in that worldview, but still. It got me thinking about things I'd never questioned before and showed me that video games could provide direct political commentary in ways I hadn't really seen before. Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney gets a shout out because I distinctly remember seeing a positive review in my Game Informer magazine and thinking, surely that can't be right. How could a game about being a lawyer be any fun? Turns out it's extremely good, and when I gave it a chance, I realized that you can make a good game about just about anything if you're clever enough. I'll give credit to Mirror's Edge here too, not for being a particularly compelling or illuminating story, but for being the first game I played and absolutely loved because of its ambition and despite its flaws. It's a deeply imperfect game, but what it does was so fresh and interesting that I loved it anyway, and that definitely had an effect on my tastes in games and stories to come. Along similar lines, a quick shout out to Okami for being the first game I played purely because of its unique and gorgeous visuals. I also want to give a shout out to some of the early artistic Flash games out there, some of which I covered in an old analysis video. Well before Dear Esther caused controversy for its lack of traditionally defined gameplay, I was playing these weird, short little games that communicated ideas through simple mechanics and artistically driven design, and I think that helped prepare me for accepting games that lay outside the popular space. When it comes down to it, we have little control over what sparks passion inside of us. There are plenty of games that came out around the same time or even before the games on this list that easily could have served the same purpose, sometimes maybe even could have served it better. Imagine if I'd played Ocarina of Time before the Phantom Menace game, or if I had a Super Nintendo and played Chrono Trigger before Final Fantasy VII. Any number of games could have gotten me here, and any number of games have been made since that could have similar effects on kids who are growing to love this medium today. And with the ways games have developed, technology's progressed, and tastes have shifted over time, I'm sure even the best games on this list have alternatives that could inspire modern audiences as or more effectively. The point here isn't that certain games are just artistically superior and will inspire a love of the medium in all who encounter them. It's just that we all have our own journeys. That even if we're late to a classic game, or first encounter a certain genre or mechanic through a less than ideal example of it, that every step on that journey is ours, and that's valuable. And this was mine. Thanks so much for watching, and special thanks to my generous and patient patrons for all of their support. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to hit that subscribe button and the little bell so you actually get notified when a new video goes up. See you next time.